Hey guys, as you know, today's video is a continuation in the series of the Letters to the Church series. In this episode, Jon and I sit down and talk about a very interesting and kind of foreign concept, at least here in the United States, and that's the issue of persecution. So stick around to the end, let me know what you think in the comments below, and we'll dive right on in. All right, chapter 7 on Letters to the Church with Francis Chan is entitled Crucified. And I'll be honest about this chapter, Jon. This one, I don't know that I could say that I'm really looking forward to, largely because as I was reading this chapter, my primary emotion and experience was one of kind of confusion. I don't know what it was like for you, but when he's talking about persecution and the kinds of trials that Christians have been facing all around the world, I really felt out of place. It was kind of like going back to high school, trying to find where do I sit down in the cafeteria, because I felt like there were things that are going on around the world in the Christian community that I don't understand and that I don't experience, particularly when it comes to persecution.
Yeah, I felt a similar emotion, and I felt like I was in a similar place to you in that, mostly of just being a little bit confused, because to me, I sat there and after listening to the chapter, I thought, are his thoughts on suffering and persecution, does he seem to be glorifying suffering almost a little bit?
Yeah.
And I think he is. And
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that wrong? I don't necessarily know, but it definitely left me in this sort of confused state, because my Christian walk, for the most part, is pretty devoid of extreme persecution.
Right. Any meaningful kind of persecution, at least.
Yeah, outside of a rude troll online,
Right. Yeah.
It just doesn't really happen that much. And part of that is the country that we live in. We live in a country that is thankfully pretty open to all faiths and expressions of faith. And unfortunately, it's usually the people of our faith who are doing most of the persecution to people of other faiths.
Oddly enough, yeah. He definitely
Yeah.
did seem to be glorifying. I liked how you use that word, persecution. He even referenced a church, I think it was in China, that had 5 pillars upon which they build their church experience and 5 pillars of their faith, as it were. And they had some of the standard things like, Bible study and prayer and ministry and things like that. But then the 5th one was actually suffering. That was the thing that they taught and expected and really kind of turned to as one of the things that grows your faith, which I can understand from a scriptural perspective. Jesus does promise, if you follow him, that you will experience persecutions. It says all who are godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So I kind of get that from a theoretical and a theological perspective. I get it. But it was so bizarre to hear it spoken of so favorably.
Yeah, and it was bizarre to hear it was almost this standpoint of persecution and suffering is something to seek out.
Yeah.
He talked a lot about churches where people were praying to suffer, and where I sort of knocked heads with that was Jesus promises that suffering will happen to those of us who are following him. Mm-hmm. Jesus, at least that I can remember, he doesn't necessarily command us to go and seek out suffering.
Yeah.
He commands us to seek him. And so my question really was has suffering sort of become an idol for Chan, perhaps in some sort of way, where instead of seeking Jesus and thereby experiencing persecution, are we seeking suffering so that we feel like we're following Jesus?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there's a lot of exterior things that we could be seeking out, that we could point to and say, this is the thing that I know that God is working through me. And sometimes we do things like, oh, does this person pay tithe, or do they study the Bible, or different kind of outward things, which no one would argue that they are bad things or they're unscriptural things. But then we put our kind of trust in these areas as though this is the reason why I know God has accepted me, as opposed to my faith in Christ. And I'm sure that Francis Chan is not actually believing that and making this point, but the way that he was describing it, it certainly kind of came across that way, that it was not just at that level was kind of taken a little bit further. And so that was kind
And
of
maybe
weird.
it's just to swing the pendulum, because like
Yeah.
we both started off this conversation by saying persecution and suffering, it is something that is almost completely
Foreign.
absent from our and foreign from our walks. So maybe it really is in an effort to swing the pendulum and show people that this is part of our lives as Christ followers.
Yeah.
Perhaps you go a little bit far in one direction.
Yeah. So there was this verse that he brought up that I've seen many times, but never kind of heard in this perspective. 1 Peter 4:12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. 1 Peter 4:12 and 13. One of his points was that we should never be surprised when we suffer trials or persecutions, but rather his point was, and I think that this is a good point, we should actually be more surprised that we're not experiencing it. So how do you reconcile this realization that Jesus promises suffering and persecution, and yet we both agree we don't experience much of that? Does that does that kind of create insecurity for you, or how do you deal with that?
I think for me, it creates sort of a conviction and a desire to reflect on when were the times in my life where I did experience some form of righteous persecution. Because let's be honest, there are times where Christians, including myself, I have just been a total jerk. And
you're not being
then I'm like,
persecuted. You're just being an idiot, and people are
yeah, you're just
responding.
being an idiot. You're
Totally.
just being a jerk. You're just being arrogant.
I've had many of those moments.
Yeah, exactly. But there are also times where, out of a genuine expression of my faith, out of a genuine desire to follow Jesus and lead others to Jesus more deeply, I have experienced suffering or persecution. And those have been sort of few and far between as I reflect on those moments.
Can you think of a moment or two that are like that?
Yeah, so back when I was working my summer job throughout college, I worked at this sort of Christian summer camp. And during that time when I was being given positions of leadership there, I was very, very passionate about bringing camp out of this like surface spiritual level and trying to get underneath what was really going on. And there was a lot of pushback from the higher ups at that camp and on the board and whatnot of, we shouldn't be doing that. Like we did a feet washing station, for example, one week. And that was like a big issue for a lot of people. And I brought up the idea of taking communion at camp or whatever it might be. Like these things that even Chan talks about are like so basic, like communion. And it's like, this is a basic command, it's a basic thing that the church should be doing. But there was so much pushback for it. And for me, it was coming out of a genuine desire to lead in a Christ-centered way and to help lead people more into a relationship with Jesus. And yet there was all this pushback that was coming.
Yeah. Do you think that was largely because of a misunderstanding, or maybe you didn't explain yourself well, or kind of like we were talking about before, you were kind of just being a jerk and how you went across that? Because maybe that was it, or were they actually like opposing the actual substance of what you were trying to put forward?
I think there's probably a mix of both of those things going on, but really I think it was out of a fear of breaking the status quo or what had always been done before.
That I can relate to a lot. When I first gave my heart to the Lord, I was like right out of high school, 17 years old. And I had made the decision that I wanted to go to this Bible college in Arizona. I wanted to commit the next couple of years to studying the Bible and do ministry and stuff like that. And it's really stereotypical, but it is true. My Asian parents were not stoked about the idea of me going to a non-accredited college. They had all these dreams and ambitions for me. And I would never describe it as persecution, but the response that I got from like a radical desire to truly follow God where I believed he was calling me, I did receive pushback from that. And I can see that played out in many different areas of my life because there's a difference between like the cultural Christianity and someone who is like earnestly trying to follow God's best for their life. Many times those paths kind of divide, and the response that I get from religious people oftentimes is like, whoa, what is going on? Questioning, concern, all from a good heart and a good place. But many times when I'm seeking to follow God fully, a lot of church folk, a lot of people just don't understand. Do you think that this is maybe the kinds of persecution or trials that we experience here in the States? Is that the closest thing that we get?
Perhaps, yeah. And it's not just those, because really what both of us are talking about here, we're both talking about experiences where fellow believers,
Yeah.
because maybe they didn't fully understand, or because they maybe weren't willing to go as deep, maybe they, out of fear, sort of pushed back.
Yeah.
But also there are plenty of instances where we in the States can experience that type of persecution from non-believers as well, as we're trying to delve deeper into our faith. But like we said, because of the country that we live in, we don't necessarily experience the physical or as much social persecution as those who live in some Middle Eastern countries, or those who even live in Mexico, for example, one of the most physically violent countries against Christians in the world.
Yeah.
That's just not something we experience.
No, absolutely. One thing that I thought was really interesting was he was talking about kind of how believers in persecuted countries, almost because of the persecution, are growing spiritually so much more. And I can understand that. There was a church father from the Reformation time frame. He was talking about how a lot of the early Christians there were being killed and persecuted for their faith. And he said something like, the blood of the martyrs was like seed for the gospel. That when people saw believers dying for their faith and happily like going through persecution and trials, that they were just like inspired, like, wow, they must have something there. And he cited, Chance cited a church in Iran that had like 3 prerequisites in order to join their church. You know, nowadays it's just like, oh, you want to join? Come join. It's cool. But they said that you had to do 3 things. You had to be willing, number 1, to lose your property. Number 2, be thrown in jail. And then number 3, be martyred for your faith before you could even become like a member of their community. And I thought that that was pretty radical, pretty cool.
Yeah. But I also think like and this is something that kind of went through my mind this entire time I was reading this chapter. I'm like, there's a very fine line between what Chan is talking about and the really negative versions of this that we see in like radical Islam, for example. You know, there's and also I thought of like Mad Max Fury Road. Have you seen that movie?
I've actually only made it through the first half on a flight.
Okay, but but these war boys,
okay,
they are like Injun Joe is like their god, and they are willing to fight, they're willing to die, they're willing to do whatever they need to do because they feel like they're getting his favor. And they're going, he has a place reserved for them, the gates of Alhalla, you know.
Okay.
And obvious, like there's a very fine line between what Shane is talking about here, being willing to absolutely give everything and
kind of going crazy, cutting off people's ears like Peter.
Yes, and like this like outside of truth version of it, and the radical in a negative sense. And I think that fine line is Jesus. You know, that our suffering comes as a result of pursuing Jesus, and suffering is almost this afterthought or this even byproduct, and this sign perhaps that we're on the right track.
Yeah.
Rather than it being an end in and of itself.
Yeah. One thing that I found really resonated with me towards the end of this chapter was talking about the societal pressures and the societal type of persecution we do experience in the U.S. when it comes to making a stance on certain truths. And I was convicted of this particularly, or challenged by this, maybe conviction's a bad word, challenged on this. He was talking about how in the U.S. we're so quick to listen to people, hear their stories, be empathetic, and really just take the time to be patient rather than immediately making a judgment call and quote unquote preaching a straight message or whatever the case is. But then he says a lot of times we go further than that, where we aren't willing to stand up for the truth. And I think of subjects like the LGBT community, things, abortion, things along those lines, where some people in an overcorrection of the angry, pointing the finger kind of Christian are so patient and empathetic to the point where they're not preaching the truth. And it made me think of some of the videos that I've done interviewing some of my friends who are part of the LGBT community, things like that. And he was making the point, some people have gone further than that, where they are not just being patient and loving, but that they are actually not speaking the truth.
Yeah, I think that's also a generational thing too.
Yeah.
I think with the millennial generation, and especially with Generation Z coming up after us, there is this, in a lot of ways, very positive, good, incredible cultural open-mindedness.
Yeah, I love it.
And this drive towards acceptance, which I think has so many positives and actually in so many ways gets back to the roots of what Jesus came and started within the church in the way he interacted with people. But yeah, at the same time, there is that same culture seems to perpetuate this idea that even if you disagree, then you're unloving.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
Which there's a big difference.
Yeah.
Like, I can love you and still disagree with it.
Yeah.
But it's really hard in our day to be able to do that.
Yeah. For me, the biggest thing that has helped me to lovingly disagree with people, I hope I've tried my best to do this, to stand for what I believe in and also be empathetic, like both simultaneously, is realizing that there needs to be that relationship there. Like with someone like Matthias, I did a series of videos on the LGBT community with Matthias. We shot like 5 or 6 videos, but that was after about 8 hours of hanging out all day. So we could get to the point where he knew that I cared about him. I wanted to hear his story. But then we could also have the more challenging conversation of, hey, I fully disagree with you, but let's talk about this. And I don't know that I did it perfectly. I'm sure there's a lot of room for growth there. But that relationship, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah, and the question really then becomes, are we willing to stake our worldly reputation in order to stand up for what we believe to be the truth, But I also think that a big portion of it is, especially with what's going on in our culture today, that's causing a lot of people to really look back and say, do I really believe that this is what the Bible teaches? And I'm not speaking exclusively about the LGBT community. I'm speaking of a bunch of other issues and things that are so prevalent in our society today. But once you have that core belief, and once you do believe that, are you willing to stake your reputation on it? Are you willing to stake relationships on it?
Yeah.
That's the suffering that Chan is getting at, I think.
Yeah. Jesus did that so well. I mean, he was hanging out with the drunkards and the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the Gentiles, and he also was willing to call them higher and to lovingly rebuke with tears in his eyes, kind of a thing. I think that example is the one that we need to strive for the most.
Yeah. I don't know how he did it, other than the fact that he was God. But man, he's good at it.
Yeah. So what do you guys think? Did anything stand out to you? Any lessons that you learned? Let me know in the comment section below. Of course, to continue this conversation, click or tap right over here to go to Jon's channel and continue this series.